Good evening, everyone, for attending our session today on the path forward for DMOs. This session today is a continuation of our collaboration between Google and BCG on how DMOs need to navigate a past-COVID or a world post-COVID in tourism, and like what needs to be done and how DMOs are at the centerpiece of that evolution. So with me on the stage is Eva Kutle. She is the Global Destination Marketing Partner, if I get it right, from Google. And she will join me today in our discussion. So thanks so much for attending, Eva. Now, my name is Clement. I'm a Managing Director in BCG. And I have the privilege to help DMOs and destinations here in the region to form and define their marketing and tourism strategy and activate them overall, and have the privilege also to help them in this very interesting time of tourism since the pandemic. Now, today what we want to do is really to explore a little bit the way of like what DMOs have to do as they are at the centerpiece of the travel recovery since the COVID pandemic, and what means do they have, what tools can they put in place to ensure that tourism is overall bouncing back nicely to the pre-COVID level of 2019 and ensure the long-term growth which we have seen in the industry over the past 25 years. What we would like to do and how we would like to structure our session today is we want to answer two questions basically. One is what are the changing travel behaviors and trends which we have seen since the last report which we have published back in September, and where do we see travelers, or what we see travelers are looking for. And the second one is really to say, how can DMOs evolve in that context to develop really into destination management organizations, so to speak, DMOs 3.0, as we call it. So with that, maybe we start with number one. And Eva, maybe you can start talking to us a little bit about the general travel trends you see as Google from the data you have.
Sure. Thank you, Hans, and thank you all for joining us. It's a much smaller event, obviously, than it usually is, but it's such a great pleasure to be here. This is actually my first in-person event in almost 2 years now. It's the first time I'm actually wearing shoes to a meeting in 2 years, so it's a major, major milestone for me. So thank you for being here. As Hans said it, and it's a very long title, but it basically means I work with destination management organizations from the Google side. I support our partners in tourism. I also work with industry bodies like UNWTO, European Travel Commission, and the likes. And basically, my mission is to help tourism organization leverage Google data and Google platforms for the recovery of tourism. So that's it in a nutshell behind a very long title. So to answer Hans' question on what's changed since we last published our joint work and had a webinar for DMOs, I would say everything and nothing. So nothing in a sense that the main thing we've observed back then, which was a huge amount of uncertainty and volatility, that's still there. And that's not going away. So the nice planning cycles and patterns that we had in the industry up until 2020 are definitely gone, and they're disrupted. And trying to form or catch or identify new patterns is still very, very difficult. So I think that remains the same. That will remain the same for some time to come. And that's definitely the key thing to keep in mind, because I think it requires all the stakeholders in tourism to keep a very, very high level of agility and understanding of what's happening in the moment. Having said that, I will take you through a couple of slides just to show you how some of the data points from the Google platforms have changed since we last spoke. But again, bear in mind that everything that I'm showing you today may not be true tomorrow, and it also varies per country and source market. So, but this is just to give you a flavor of how things are going. So we are seeing that the international air travel searches on google.com are slowly picking up every day, but this is still very slow and still way below 2019 levels. Now, Google search is a good indicator of intent, right? So you can, if you want to understand how people feel about something, you can ask them in a survey, but you can also look at what's happening at google.com and what they're searching for, because this, I think, illustrates their true intent and interest for some reason. The other thing that we're seeing is that what people are searching for definitely continues to change every month. So last year, when we did this analysis at the beginning of the pandemic, people were asking a lot of questions trying to make sense of what this means for travel and whether they can travel in the first place. Now they're getting more granular. They're trying to understand the rules and the procedures and what's the meaning of things like travel corridors. And basically, the one question that always remains is, when can we travel and where can we travel? And that's what everyone wants to know. But again, these queries, you will see they're impacted every month by the public health situation. They're impacted by the vaccination pace. They're impacted by a number of things, which is why it's very important for DMOs and all the other travel stakeholders to stay on top of these questions. Like, these questions need to be answered by someone. DMOs are best positioned to answer them, and they need to think about the kind of content and channels they need to use to answer those questions. The third thing that we've seen since we last spoke is, although the search for travel is decreasing, the interest in video, not just travel video, but video overall, has skyrocketed because people are turning to YouTube to basically cope with their new reality. And to learn how to be more productive working from home, to learn how to homeschool their children, how to deal with stress, how to cook, etc. And so this, I think, is a great opportunity for travel brands and for destinations to connect with their audiences in a context that's perhaps slightly different than their traditional travel content, but still it's a great opportunity to step in and meet a need. So I always use the example of destinations that are big on food. If you're one such destination, you can definitely step in and help people cook from home and build that brand equity, although people are not traveling to your destination at the moment. So be mindful that, yes, video is a huge resource for people during this pandemic, and it has really bred a whole category of new content online, basically. The other thing is that we're seeing is that people are trying to travel virtually. So the searches for virtual or digital travel experiences have also skyrocketed since the beginning of the pandemic. So it's critical for travel brands and particularly destinations to be able to deliver that experience to them at home, whether through virtual tours, through Google Arts and Culture, through live streams. So anything that can basically help them fill that void that has appeared with the absence of actual travel, and actually prepare them for the experience that they will have once they're back. The other thing that we've seen since our last conversation is how the interest in vaccine and travel has evolved. So when the pandemic first started, people turned to Google to understand how will vaccine develop? How long does it take to develop it? And now they're interested in, okay, I've been vaccinated. How do I travel? Is there a COVID passport required, or do I need to be vaccinated to travel to a particular destination? And so the correlation between vaccination and travel is definitely there. Again, it's another area of information that DMOs need to manage. Their prospective travelers need to be aware of what the situation is in the country with respect to vaccine, what are the requirements if they want to travel to particular destinations. It's a huge area of interest to keep in mind. And they're trying to make sense of the rules, so make sure that those rules are known to them. And finally, this is something very interesting where I'd like to spend a bit of time on. Is we've seen two key shifts basically in the decision making. The first one is what we call from having three spaces or having the third space to 1/3 of a space. And the other one is the question that we used to ask ourselves at the beginning of the pandemic, which is it safe to do something? The question now is more along the lines of, is it worth it? So let me explain. We like to believe that prior to the pandemic, a typical person would have three spaces in their life that they would frequent, right? Their home, their work, and another space or spaces, whether they're recreational or restaurants or places you used to take your family to. And if you think about it, people have been reduced during the pandemic for extended periods of time to actually 1/3 of the space. So within their homes, they suddenly had to work and educate their children and have some fun and relax themselves. So everything is confined to this 1/3 of the space. So what happened initially is that all the search queries related to things you can do at home really shot up at the beginning of the pandemic, right? How do I cook at home? How do I work from home, etc. The other thing that we observed is that at the beginning of the pandemic, everyone was asking, is it safe? And the majority of those questions were related to travel, which, if you think about it, makes sense, right? Because travel was one of the first industries that was impacted. But as time goes by, we're seeing that those searches are reducing in volume and they're becoming more granular, which tells us that people are trying to figure out whether a particular experience is worth it. Not purely is it safe, but if I make the effort to travel somewhere now, is that really worth it? Am I at the health risk? Will it be money well spent? Will I have the same experience as I would if it were not for the pandemic? Will I have to go through tests? Will I have to wear a mask? So I think people are now getting a lot more sophisticated and granular in what they're asking, trying to figure out if it's worth it. And that, again, is a huge task for DMOs and for travel stakeholders to answer that question. So it's no longer just about, is it safe and do you have the protocols in place? It's also about convincing that person who has to sometimes jump through the hoops to get to your destination that that's really what they should be doing with their time and money. So I think that's the critical shift that we've observed.
And that's exactly what we wanted to get out of the discussion and our overall collaboration. From the shift from September, when everything was so uncertain, the only certainty that you couldn't travel, to, okay, there are places which are open to travel, but people don't know what they need to do, what they are expected at the destination, and so on. So maybe from here, what do you think, shall we switch over to then the second topic, which we discussed overall in terms of like, what do DMOs overall need to do? And I think this was where we started the overall concept of, we defined it, I think, as DMOs 3.0s. And for us, the important element was really around saying, it is not destination marketing organizations anymore. It's really the focus needs to be on destination management organizations. So that is really the key focus. And I maybe starting from there, because we have introduced in our last paper the concept of this analytical lighthouse, no? So that we are overall saying now, similar to a lot of other companies which we see across industries, that it's all about data-driven decision making. And it's not about the analysis of like past historic data on like what have travelers done in the past and therefore deriving recommendations for the past forward, but it's really around building up this predictive capability in order to understand what will come next. So maybe we start from there, because I think this is going to be imperative and at the centerpiece on like how DMOs will operate in the future. And I don't know, maybe you want to start a little bit to think or to tell us what you see, what is important on that data-driven decision making and the concept of this analytical lighthouse, we call it.
Sure. So I think it's not a secret that DMOs and travel companies sit on a lot of data, right? So there are various sources that we can use to understand a lot of different things. And so I think it starts with an understanding of what you need to know as an organization and which tools, which resources, and which processes can give you that information. As I told you earlier, everything that I'm showing you here may not be true tomorrow, or it may not be true for all countries. So the ability of DMOs to be agile in how they source and process and implement data is critical. And our experience with DMOs, obviously they're very different levels, but a lot of DMOs tend to have traditional processes in place where, you know, you would take a year to collect the data from various sources. Perhaps that would go into your marketing planning, perhaps not. And so now all of that has been disturbed, and the ability to leverage digital platforms to understand what's happening and what are the things that are relevant to you is critical, as well as having the right people and to make sure you're implementing that. Again, the other thing about data is that it keeps changing. So defining what it is that you're tracking is paramount. And being prepared, what data enables you to do is basically be prepared for a variety of scenarios, right? Rather than being reactive and just waiting for things to happen and then doing something about it. The whole purpose of using data-driven process is to be able to shape your decisions in advance and have a scenario basically for every situation. I think when the pandemic started, a lot of us were hoping that it would have like a nice linear progression, that it would go through 2 or 3 stages and then it would end. Yeah. Somehow we're now seeing that that's not happening, that there's a lot of back and forth. Countries open and they close down, and sometimes the vaccination is going well, sometimes it's not. And so for countries to be able to plan for all the different scenarios and all the different audiences and mindsets that have come out of this pandemic is critical. Some of the mindsets that have been produced by the pandemic are perhaps temporary, but there are some things and some trends that are probably here to stay. I, for one, don't see myself ever going into a hotel that's at 100% occupancy, not necessarily for health concerns. It's just that I don't think I can tolerate that kind of hassle anymore. So understanding which trends are here temporarily and which ones are here to stay will be critical to the DMO's ability to adapt and to have the right response for every situation.
Yeah. Eva, I really love this concept, what you showed earlier around like the shift from third space to 1/3 of a space, and then really from is it safe to is it worth it. I think this is paramount to all the decision making which DMOs need to answer going forward as well. So maybe we can shift to, and you can explain that a little bit more, because that is also creating a different dimension to what we have traditional seen for DMOs, no? From a classical segmentation, when they thought around what are my visitor segments, what are my geographies where my travelers are coming from, what are the travel preferences in terms of booking, where do they want to stay, and so on. All by sudden we are introducing a complete new dimension. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit, because that will fundamentally also shift the planning process and the process in terms of like how do we as you mentioned earlier, no, the scenario planning, because I assume within our source market or within the source markets of respective DMOs, you will see a lot of shifts among these four quadrants. To say like, okay, there's now a bucket of much more optimists who say like, okay, we see now as in our country travel is safe and in our favorite destinations we can go again. Or to people, depending on where they're from, they're more the bucket of curious or cautious people are much stronger. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit, and then we shift from there.
Sure. So I think this isn't a tool that's set in stone by any means, but I think it can help DMOs structure their thinking around the content and messaging that they need to have. Because the one question that we get from everyone is, okay, so what do we do? What do we communicate? What if our country is closed for travel or semi-closed for travel? What should we be doing? And so this can perhaps help you structure the thinking. So basically this grid here categorizes mindsets and readiness of users based on the two criteria, which is basically how willing are they to venture out of their third of a space into a third space. And there's a very helpful tool that can perhaps be of assistance with this. It's called Google Mobility Report. It's a public free tool. If you just Google it, it will come up. It's available for every country. And this is real data, real-time data that actually comes from Google Maps that shows you the readiness and how much people are actually venturing out into public spaces in particular countries. So whether they're going to restaurants, parks, cafes, libraries, and etc. So that's about our readiness to go out, to travel, to explore, to move out of our confined space. The other axis is around whether people are closer to the is it safe mentality or is it worth it? And so based on that, there are four categories. The open ones are those who are ready to go and they just need to be convinced that it's worth it, right? They want to travel, they're out there, they're just deciding which destination they're going to and exploring their options. Let me share something interesting with you. Even before COVID, more than 50% of people who were researching travel online did not have a destination in mind. So your audience can be pretty much anyone. People you were not considering could be convinced to come to you because maybe they started off their search with the Mediterranean cruise, but ended up on a Caribbean beach because these things happen, to me certainly. Yeah. And so if this was happening even before COVID, imagine now all the consideration on where and when and how people can travel. So those are your prime prospects, people who are open and who need to be told that they can come to you and that if they do, it's definitely worth their time and money. Then on the left, you will have the optimistic ones. They're the ones who are not quite ready to get out of their safe zone, but they're definitely higher up there on exploring whether it's worth it. So, if you reassure them that it's okay, and you have messaging around that, that can be one strategy to talk to them. The other two are perhaps less willing to venture out, so they need more convincing, more reassurance. And so there needs to be a communication strategy, and then and not just a communication strategy, but potentially a product strategy, a full marketing strategy around each of these mindsets. And people will fluctuate between them as the situation changes. So someone who was cautious might become open, and vice versa. And that's why that agility and multiple scenario planning is so important.
Yeah. Great. Maybe we move now, because we said that there are multiple dimensions of our DMO 3.0. No? So one was at the core of it to really have this analytical lighthouse, as we called it. No, but that's one of the element. And then the second one, which we just discussed, was the overall planning process, the scenario building, sort of like the agility of this whole process overall. No, I think one other element was also in terms of like having, for instance, now the consumer archetypes which you just described in mind. We were also saying like the shift from marketing into management will also need to be very evident now from an operating model, or how DMOs conduct their business going forward. Because as you said, this is not only about messaging, but it's also around ensuring that the product, the services are on the ground, in place, no? And
Correct.
therefore
Yeah. And this is something where you do a lot of work, is my understanding, in the whole stakeholder outreach area. So.
Exactly. And that, I think, is really the third point which we wanted to come to say, like, nowadays DMOs really need to spend much more time on everything when it comes to stakeholder management. I think they are really at the centerpiece of the recovery of all the tourism, and they are in a position which they were not necessarily before, because nowadays the interactions of a DMO with, for instance, the public health authorities, with the immigration authorities, with like things like national disaster committees, these are all elements which they were not at the forefront on, and like basically just on the receiving end. What we see now, very successful destinations overall, or how they operate, is that they are providing significant input into the decision making of a country, to also ensure that messages are simple, are to be followed by all the private stakeholders, by all the other public stakeholders. So for a tourist, as you said, in the intent phase of the search, someone can say easily, okay, I need a vaccine, or I do need a PCR test on arrival and at departure, but that's it. So things need to be extremely simple, and therefore we believe that DMOs have to have the seat at the table. And right now, when we look at certain destinations, Dubai, I think, is a fantastic example of it. A DMO who sits at the table with the other government stakeholders and make the norms and the decisions for the country or for the destinations, they are very successful in attracting visitors. Other destinations where DMO is still very much on the receiving end, you see that there's a lot of uncertainty, and that travelers are less bound to come. So I think stakeholder management on a local level, but also on a national level, is becoming extremely important as the new DMO 3.0, because it's beyond purely health and safety, but it's overall the entire experience.
You're spot on. And there's so much more complexity to it now than 2 years ago, because 2 years ago the whole process was a lot more predictable.
Yeah.
Whereas now it's changing daily, and there's so much uncertainty, and there's a burden on DMOs as well to communicate clearly and set the expectations for the travelers. And so their role should by no means be passive and just relaying that message, but also in shaping that experience. And I have no doubt that the vast part of that experience, even post-pandemic, whatever that means and whenever that comes, will be largely digital.
Yeah.
And the reason I'm saying this is not just because I'm from Google, but because we'll definitely continue to see people seeking information online, seeking to do as many things online as possible as part of their journey, without unnecessary hassle, paperwork, and interactions. And so DMOs really need to be stakeholders in designing that journey with the other players in the ecosystem, rather than just passive messengers to the travelers. Okay, this is what you can expect once you're
Exactly.
here.
Absolutely, no. So I think this we will see that much more going forward, that they need to have that view from the visitor overall, and like not saying like, okay, you need to visit the pages, for instance, of the public health authorities and then try to understand what's happening. I think they need to also be a translator of how a visitor would like to come and enjoy.
Definitely. And if you think about it, before COVID, DMOs would typically, their job typically was to generate the demand for the destination at a very high level. And a typical tourism board would tell you, okay, in this country, you can go skiing or diving or swimming, and we have great restaurants. And that was about it. And
Yeah.
so now there's all of a sudden, there's so much demand from the travelers to understand so much more granularly what is happening. And they now have requirements and expectations that were simply not there before. So I think it's a very exciting time. I think the industry will need to redefine itself. Although the numbers are still not looking good, I think it's still a very exciting time to
Yeah.
be in the industry.
Yeah. But again, coming back to our slide, which you see on the screen, I think it's so rich in terms of like understanding what a DMO needs to do, because again, in the past, as you said, it's around like making a destination attractive. Now the messaging needs to be different. It's terms like, is it worth it? I think we are going back to the fundamentals on why people travel and why your destinations are fulfilling these needs, these essential needs a traveler have. So basically reinventing this whole prospect. This is one. But on the other side, then a DMO also needs to say like, okay, we have hospitality capacity, we have testing capacity, we have these emergency type of capacities to provide, for instance, the people on the cautious bucket all the reassurance that like if you travel, it is safe as well. So I think the bandwidth on what we need to provide as a DMO is also becoming huge going forward, and that is very important. So that was a third one. I think there was one other dimensions which we thought is extremely important, or which we wanted to make sure, is the whole notion around the visitor journey. You know? So we were thinking around nowadays, a visitor journey becomes so complex, because in the past it was around, okay, you generate the demand, as you said, from the intent stage until the departure, basically. And only some DMOs have really started to map out the entire journey step by step, ensured what of the steps are important and have the highest sort of like contribution to the NPS at the end of the day. But nowadays, I think we need to ensure that a DMO has this holistic picture in mind and ensures that we are giving comfort for a traveler across board. As an example, I was just over the Eat break now in a destination. I don't want to name now the destination because that would be slightly embarrassing. But I was being asked to keep 1.5 meter distance at the security gate, but then I was being pushed into the bus, which brought me to the airplane with the entire airplane. So there was a complete mismatch between what I was being told at one step of my journey versus other steps of my journey, and it feels really uncomfortable, and it creates this sort of like anxiety to say, why is this happening? And what we believe is now that DMOs need to map out the journey, ensure that the respective stakeholders in the journey steps are aware of their contribution and like the contribution to the overall satisfaction of the visitors. And I think we also need to ensure that like the DMO will be sort of like set the baseline to ensure that I think it's a very competitive space nowadays. If you see that some destinations, they have proven to be very successful to ensure security, comfort overall for the visitors. And I think DMOs should be that information lighthouse, again, to provide to the stakeholders to say, look, this is what other destinations do. They do the digital payments, contactless check-in, seamless integration without handing over, without having any physical interactions with a visitor in any shape or form. So I think DMOs will also need to build up that competitive intelligence for the stakeholders. I don't know if you seen that as well in terms of like, you've seen that in terms of your data on the passport, the vaccine passport, for instance, but also in terms of your queries, no?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think even before COVID, the visitor journey was very complicated. If we just look at the pre-arrival journey and how do I arrive at the decision to travel somewhere, this was a very, very complex map with sometimes more than 300 touch points. You know, we like to think of the visitor journey as a funnel, as a linear journey. That's not the case. As I mentioned, even before the pandemic, people would explore different options, go back and forth between they would make their final decision. At some point, they might have been influenced by Google search. At some point, you know, they might have talked to a friend. They might have seen something on social media. And so all of those 300 plus touch points would eventually result in a decision to travel to A versus B. And so now add to all of that now the complexity of COVID, the restrictions, the is it worth it to travel in the first place, or should I be doing something else with my time and money? So the pre-arrival journey is complicated. There's if as a DMO you're not leveraging the digital tools up to its maximum, then this is definitely the time to get on that train, because otherwise there's no way to keep track of what's happening, what the priorities are. When we talk about the journey, we look at different sources, right? We look at Google search because that's a very good indicator of intent. We look at YouTube. It's a place where people massively consume travel content. We also do consumer surveys, Google consumer surveys, which is a quick online tool to gauge interest or to survey a particular topic. And sometimes you will see contradicting data between the different sources. And so you need to make sense of all that. And that's, again, why having those capabilities is now critical, because the answers are out there and you can get them. But as an organization, you need to make sure that there's a process and capability to do that. And that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of the DMOs that we work with have actually used the pandemic to grow their capabilities, to train their staff. We've actually launched a specific DMO curriculum to be able to, for them to be able to understand how to use data and tools to understand that visitor cycle. And so that's just pre-arrival. And then once they're in the destination, that's where I think the whole stakeholder management conversation comes in, because if the ecosystem was previously not working as a system but as silos,
Yeah.
well, that now particularly doesn't work, right? Because you want to connect those dots to have that seamless journey. So there is a lot of complexity there, and the thing with digital is that it's simple and it's complicated at the same time. And I know that the transformation seems very daunting to a lot of organizations, but then I think once you set up your objectives the right way and you use the platforms that are out there properly, it becomes a much easier process in detecting that visitor cycle and how well you're doing on it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and that leads me, I think, to our last point in terms of on the reinvention of DMO 3.0 is the whole element around the operating model. And you were alluding to it in terms of capability building in order to use data, read data, assess data, and act upon it. Because I think you in your daily life have a lot of like situations in which DMOs are thirsty for insights, provide me more insights, and we have the same, like more, draw out more insights from the consumer surveys and so on and so forth. But then the question is really, how do you use it? How does it trickle down to each individual in the organization so they can connect the dots, ensure that everyone was working towards the one common goal, and use not the gut feelings anymore, but really the ever-evolving data which we see, or the data sentiments which we see in from our work here. I think there's one other element, and that's for us also embedded in the overall larger picture around operating models for DMOs. When you were saying the visitor journey is absolutely critical in our view to make a destination really attractive, fulfill all the requirements from the visitors, and score relatively high in NPS scores so that you have a repeated type of visitation, because that's overall how you drive down the cost of activating future visitors as well. But one of them is, if you do not have a proper destination governance in place as well, then all of that is going to be extremely difficult. And we see that nowadays here as well in the region of new DMOs and new tourism destinations who are being set up, that this is key for them in terms of like, how are they going to introduce a proper governance at the country level, at a destination level? How can you influence it, and what means do you have as well? Because one thing, and what becomes very evident, is that the DMOs will understand the power of their data, of their aggregated data, which they can share with the respective stakeholders. To say, I know which visitors are coming, I know the travel window, I know the preferences generally, I have it all aggregated, and if you want to participate as one of my stakeholders in improving the overall journey, I can share with you the data, I can promote you, I can overall direct certain visitors in terms of like your offerings and so on. So I think that becomes very important on making a destination successful. The overall governance on like how the interactions between DMOs and the service providers, and how do you enforce this type of governance. And governance, it's not in that form only about money or funding from a DMO, but I think what they are exploring these days is really around the power of data as a currency at the end of the day, which they will share. And I think you are working on that as well, on like how do you aggregate the data from various sources, no?
True, and I think DMOs, like many other organizations, used to operate on an autopilot prior to the pandemic, and because a lot of things were going smoothly, and there were patterns that were repeating, so there wasn't an immediate change to demand to change things dramatically. But now that's definitely there. So what I would say for any DMO right now, the key questions, and not just DMOs, any organization, the key questions to ask yourselves now are, do we have the right people? Do we have the right capabilities? Do we have the right processes? And do we have the right partnerships and tools? Because I think that will ultimately decide how equipped they are to deal with what tourism will be going forward. And this may require some very significant changes in the organization and how things are done. But I think eventually those who are able to get on that train faster than others will have a competitive advantage. I keep referring to when things go back to normal, although we don't know when and what that means. Those destinations that have been able to transform themselves during this crisis, who've stayed in touch with the consumers, with the travelers, despite the restrictions, who've managed to understand what's important now, I think they will benefit hugely once everyone gets back in the game and starts communicating and convincing people to come to their destination.
Yeah, no. So I think these were like the main points which we wanted to cover overall in terms of like our DMO 3.0 evolution, I would say. And I think to conclude, really, it's around, for us, a couple of points which we wanted to reiterate. One was to say, in terms of the consumer trends and the behaviors and the sentiments, which you showed earlier, Ivan, no? It's about, in September, it was all about, is it safe and when can we travel again? And now the whole mindset have shifted into, is it worth it? What do I expect? And the differentiation between our different buckets of consumers. And with that, I think we can just reiterate and reinforce our message, which we want to bring to all the DMOs, is to constantly keep an eye and an ear on like the travel sentiments and the behavior, because it will be evolving. It will be evolving so fast, like it hasn't evolved in the last 10 years. What we will see, what we have seen in the past 18 months and what we will see in the near future. So I think this is going to be extremely critical. Then I think out of that, as a consequence, we really say, like, at the centerpiece of any successful DMO, we need to have this analytical lighthouse, because that will set the tone in which direction should a DMO go. We talked about the scenario planning in terms of the overall planning process, because we have supported a lot of the DMOs to say, like, okay, do your annual plan, provide it into your country plans, roll out your marketing budget, and off you go, and you're just doing quarterly assessments in terms of, like, are you meeting the targets or not? I think that stage has completely passed, and we need to have a much more agile planning process, all driven by what's happening in my source countries, what is happening with my different demand buckets, segments, what channels, what categories, and what geographies do I target now, because I have the offering for these type of travelers. Then we talked about the overall alignment in terms of the stakeholder management, so that DMOs need to be very at the forefront of, like, all the decision making in the destinations, with all the respective public health or public authorities, like such as like health authorities, but also in terms of like national disaster committees and so on, but also with the private sector, to combine all of them and provide a holistic, integrated offering, which goes hand in hand to our next point, which was around the visitor journeys. To really say, we need to have this end-to-end process in mind, or the end-to-end journey, and ensure that everybody in the journey provides the right experience. And that needs to be measured, and that needs to have certain governance in place as well at the destination level, so that you can incentivize the respective stakeholders to do what you as a destinations decide to do, and what you believe is correct. Because it needs to be integrated. And that's what travelers are expecting now, because they really look into, is it worth? And I think, is it safe will always be a predominant question. No, that's sort of like a hygiene factor, which we will see in the future. So that was the other piece. And then the first one was really around the operating model. No, the operating model in terms of, like, what type of capabilities do we need to have in place at a destination? What processes do we need to put in place? Ensure that the overall mindset goes away from a destination marketing organization to a destination management organization, that the product teams, the commercial teams, the stakeholder teams, the marketing teams all work hand in hand and upgrade the overall experience, or the overall offering at a destination. And I think what you, once I go through that again, what you realize is that they are all interconnected with each other. So you cannot go step by step. It's like all interconnected, as we said, stakeholder management, visitor journeys, and the operating model, and the whole planning cycle. So I think this is, in our view, where the whole journey goes to for DMO 3.0 to be successful. Some of the DMOs which we are working with, Eva and I, they are doing it fantastically well, and we believe that they are on great track. Some others, I think we have overall a bit of catch up to do, and this is overall a space in which we see a fierce competition. No? That's what we were discussing earlier as well, Eva, that it has become so competitive, and there will be a whole change of like market share allocation in the future of destinations, which was kind of like unexpected and unknown to some of the destinations. I think you were mentioning earlier the example of skiing and so on. Like how do you attract different buckets of visitors? Correct?
True. Some of the that's another thing we've seen during the pandemic is how some of the unexpected niches and destinations have benefited because people could no longer travel to their usual destinations, or they couldn't do the things that they would normally do at a certain time of the year, which gave the opportunity to some of the less explored places and less explored ways of spending your time to rise. But these things will keep changing. And that's why you're spot on. It's very important for DMOs to stay on top of this. I think COVID just expedited the transformation that was meant to happen anyway with DMOs. As Google, the number one request that we used to get and that we still get from everyone, as you can guess, it's data and insights, right? Everyone wants data and insights from us. It's what can you tell us about this, or what can you tell us about that? And my question is always, so what do you do with this? I'll share the insights. What will you do? Will it translate into a marketing campaign? Will it translate into a product? What do you do with data, and how do you do it? And occasionally we see examples of where DMOs are able to translate what we're telling them into an outcome, and then that's really brilliant. That's the data-driven product and marketing. So I think that transformation was starting to happen before COVID, and we expect that it will be expedited and continued now with the new reality actually that was brought on them.
Perfect. So I think with that sort of like conclusion of our session, we would be happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, thank you so much for attending today, and we hope that we will have more face-to-face interactions again and move away, a little bit away from the pure online session. So thank you for giving us the opportunity to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you from my end as well.